also had to be careful not to be so judgmental on my grandparents because I also understood that it was a different time, and also it was also a different time socioeconomically. So whereas in, the 60s and 70s, people in the African American context weren't really affluential, didn't really have many opportunities. So when they gave all their time, they tithe, and they gave their best to the church, they gave their time and their effort, their resources to the church, the pastor really felt the ownership of ensuring that people are progressing, people are moving forward, people are healthy, people have provision. And so whatever we need to do, let's just make it happen. But we're in a much different time. Hey, welcome. My name is Alex Williams. I am a pastor of the Institutional International Ministries Church, aka Institutional Church of God in Christ, downtown Brooklyn, New York. I'm a community leader, faith liaison, and also this is my faithly story.
Could you tell me how your faith journey started?
Yes. So I'm a third generation pastor on both sides of my family. So both of my grandfathers, my maternal and paternal grandfathers, were both like bishops, pastors in the Pentecostal context. And my dad was a pastor. My mom is a pastor. My brothers are pastors. My uncles are pastors. So literally I had no escape. I tried, but no escape. But it clearly didn't fare out too well.
Well, that's what we call failing forward. Wait,
Yeah.
so did you know your maternal grandfather was a pastor when you were dating your wife?
Well, let me clarify. My mom's father was a bishop, and then my dad's father was a bishop. So when my parents met, they were both PKs, pastor's kids, and then they met, had me, and I grew up in my grandfather's church in Jersey. And then when I turned about 12 or 13, I joined Institutional, which was my grandfather and my dad's church.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Yes.
So I feel like you're in a unique situation to answer this question. What was it like being a grandchild of a pastor and then growing up realizing, oh, wait, my parents are also pastors, Because a lot of
Yeah.
times people have that PK experience, but not like the grand PK experience.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty unique question and a unique context in that because my parents were pastors' kids and the type of context, church context that they grew up in, there was also a huge awareness of what they carried, the weight of their family name, the weight of their responsibilities. And so inadvertently it was kind of impressed upon us as well, but then also there also were some awarenesses that they had or some experiences that they had that they didn't want to repeat with me. So there were some pros and cons in that respect. So they understood what I went through, but because of their sacrifice that they had to make as PKs, the same expectation was kind of placed on myself. You know what I mean?
So what were some of the differences between your grandparents and your parents, like expectations and pros and cons?
Sure. My grandparents were highly traditional. Many of them, they were first generation believers, first generation pastors and leaders. So the expectation was very high. And although their attempt and their sincerity was there in terms of their faith. Obviously, if you're in the Pentecostal context in those early years, kind of dogmatic in a sense, highly dogmatic and really dedicated to the context in which they were raised. My parents were a bit more liberal. They listened to music outside of gospel music. So I got a little bit of that. They weren't as dogmatic. We were able to go to the movies. My grandparents didn't allow my parents to go to the movies. And just certain things that were just kind of outside of the traditional context that my parents gave me the leeway to do. They were a bit more exposed to the world, so allowed my father traveled a lot. The choir that my church came out of, they traveled internationally all around the world. So my dad's been to Japan and Russia and Paris and Brazil and all over the world. And so because of that, I was able, when I was young, to travel a lot to Greece and Switzerland and just different places that the choir traveled. So it was a great experience in that respect.
So what are some of the things that you do differently than your parents, or like your understanding of parenting parents?
Yeah, I've taken it several degrees further. The first thing that I did when becoming a pastor was changing the name of our ministry, and we left the Kojic tradition, celebrate all of its roots and all of the things that I learned and some of the principles that I still carry with me. But I knew that the context that the Lord called me to was much broader than just a denomination. And I really kind of find when you see a Baptist name on a church or AME or Pentecostal or whatever the context of the church is, it kind of isolates some people. So I knew that the Lord was calling me to something broader, that my community that I was taking on and pastoring in was ever changing and growing, expanding, and becoming more diverse. And so I knew that the Lord wanted to expand the ministry. In terms of me personally, I have a pastor that has earrings. I think that would have been controversial. My grandparents would be rolling over in their grave. Yeah, we have all different people that kind of attend our churches. Just the culture is just people come as you are, they dress as you are, and I kind of apply that also to our household. We have some, of course, we have order in our household, but one of the things that I want to be very clear is not to impose any of my, I wanted to say principles. I think that principles and values should transfer down and transfer forward, but I don't want to say, okay, because I'm a pastor, my son has to be a pastor. Don't want to place those heavy expectations on him, because in that regard, he would be fourth generation, and that's tough to carry the weight of that.
Yeah, I always say there's a difference between principles and preferences.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think that all of us are going to have our preferences. One of the things, even with my calling, I wanted to make sure that just because my dad was a cop, I wasn't a cop, or he a chef, me be a chef. When it came down to my vocation, wanted to make sure that it was really something that the Lord called me to. Because I've seen everything, Danny. Like, I've witnessed everything. My parents and my grandparents were the type of people who, when people would get saved in their church, if they had a rough past, like, they would have quarters for them. They would live with them, under the context with a pastor was, everything, not just your pastor, but your doctor, your co-signer, your your financial advisor, your psychiatrist. Your pastor was everything back then. And so my grandparents would house people. They would support people financially. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't still do that, but in a way that there were no boundaries between house and church and state, right? So there were no lack of boundaries in that respect. And so, yeah, I want to make sure that we keep a healthy balance between the two with my wife and I versus the traditions that I came from.
Yeah, I think like something that like I forget all the time is that people are doing the best within their context,
Yeah.
because just because someone did it like a certain way back in the day, we're living literally in a different time and different
Yeah.
technology and different understandings of people and like more people. So like I think healthy boundaries are a good thing. And one thing like I think I repeated on the podcast is there are differences between boundaries, like borders and walls, right?
Mm.
Like borders are good things, but walls is like, oh, I want to keep you out. But borders is like, hey, like this is so that we stay safe.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, and I've seen in my experience, either certain aspects of my family or just outside of my family, I've seen how the church has become the pastor's mistress at times. How the church, if not governed correctly, could take priority over the family, and you can't. It's hard to distinguish where one begins and where the other ends. And so, the healthy boundary allows us to place alignment in terms of God's order, and it also helps us to have a healthy relationship with God's church. And I think that if we're not having those boundaries, and establishing those boundaries, we have an unhealthy relationship with the church where it becomes toxic.
Yeah, my hot take is I think it comes out of ego, of like
Right.
the Messiah complex. And I say that because I had it. So
Ah,
I think, we all go through it, but you realize like, oh, I need to be faithful to the small little circle that God is placing in my life. And these people are an extension to that, but they're not like within my circle.
sure. And it's pretty interesting that you say that. I also had to be careful not to be so judgmental on my grandparents, because I also understood that it was a different time, and also it was also a different time socioeconomically. So whereas in, the 60s and 70s, people in the African American context weren't really affluential, didn't really have many opportunities. So when they gave all their time and they tithe and they gave their best to the church, they gave their time and their effort, their resources to the church, the pastor really felt the ownership of ensuring that people are progressing, people are moving forward, people are healthy, people have provision. And so whatever we need to do, let's just make it happen. But we're in a much different time in that there are definitely much more resources outside of the church context. And we understood some of the damaging effects of operating in that way.
Yeah, so like my parents, like they came from Korea, like in the early '80s, and
Mm,
like they got saved here, like they went to church. But I always say like the Korean church is more like a community center, right? And I don't say that in a
mm,
bad way. I think we should like understand the heart and follow the heart, because again, they just really wanted to care for their people because they were being oppressed or like put down
sure.
socioeconomically. But I think it's okay to push back on the methodology, right? It's just like, oh
Sure.
yeah, we can do the same thing, but in a different way.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's important. We grow older and we learn better, and we try to be much more efficient. And we try to become wiser with our decisions and understand the damaging effect of some of the great intention that they had.
So this is like the longest I went without like starting from the beginning, which is great. 'Cause this is great context, you know? So like growing up in a household where like your grandparents are like pastors, like your parents are pastors, like, and I get the whole like I don't want to be a pastor because I don't want to be in the family business. Like, how did you come to faith? Like, was it at a young age, at an older age, and then like what was the rebelliousness?
Sure, sure. It's pretty funny that you say that. So, yeah, most of my life, especially adolescent, teenage years, early young adult years, have been the fight against my last name, the fight for identity. That's really kind of where the fight was. And so, I got saved when I was 12. Never forget, it was actually Thanksgiving service. So, coming up on an anniversary, just finished, celebrating an anniversary there. But of course, when I went into high school, more so college, my rebellion was not in me kind of operating in a way that was outlandish or brought any shame to my parents' name. I understood the weight of the assignment to be a pastor's kid in terms of a model, somewhat, but intellectually I would be all over the place. I would study everything. I would ask questions. Theologically, there were some aspects that I was going into. I'm studying outside of the Christian context, new age, belief systems, different things outside of the Christian context. And to be honest, my parents really didn't have an answer for it because I understood their context. I understood the Bible very well, but I also had all of this new information that was coming to me. And, that compiled with a lot of deaths in my family. When we prayed for healing, I had three aunts that passed away from cancer in the minimum of 5 years apart. Grandparents, those foundational pillars passed away. And so I really struggled with my faith, really struggled to, if a God that we pray to doesn't answer our prayers, then what's the point? If his will is going to be done either way, then what's the point of being committed to prayer or to the faith if it really merits very little? But I actually came to a place where um I had just a revelation and encounter with the Lord through my own prayer time. And the Lord really had a visitation in my bedroom. And it was great because it was outside of the church context. Because when you're a PK or a pastor's kid, you struggle to make, distinguish between the spiritual aspect and community aspect. Or, if my father's preaching or giving me a prophetic word or however he's used to impart into me, I don't know if that's dad or pastor. It's hard to kind of distinguish the two. So it was great that the Lord had to have his own encounter with me. And every time I've had a great encounter with the Lord where he has spoken to me and gave me vision for the future or given me instruction of what to do, or even pastoring. Even after gave my life to the Lord, recommitted, served for a while, when my dad said, I believe the Lord called you to this, the Lord had to show me himself. And so every major encounter that I've had with the Lord has been personal and outside of the influence specifically of my father, because the Lord knew that I needed to hear his voice and not confuse that with the voice of my dad or my mom.
Yeah, that's something like I'm also realizing this year. So I was a pastor for 10 years, and then I'm coming out more of a reformed tradition, which is like the polar opposite of your childhood experience. But I grew up quasi charismatic, but like
Mm.
I realized like indoctrination, there's just like this double-edged sword. We call it education or like teaching, but actually it's just indoctrination. And I'm not saying it's like literally a bad thing. I think it becomes a bad thing when, like for me, it was like, oh, this is the truth and you better believe this. And there's no way to like test it, or like their
Sure.
tests are like self-fulfilling prophecies, of
Mhm.
their own doctrine. And then I realized like 2 years ago, I was like put in a corner just personally, and so I was like, okay, I'm gonna start over. I don't know anything, right?
That's so
And I
great.
just started with Jesus, and then I went to like quantum physics and like history and like New
Mm.
Age stuff and like enneagram. Like I went all over the place, and I
Yeah,
realized when you're on this journey and you like understand Jesus in a personal way through the scriptures, there is a voice, right? There is a language of like, right? And this sounds kind of like new agey, but like for me, it is an experience of like this feels right to me, right?
sure.
And the confidence for me for the feeling was like it feels right because I feel more connected to Jesus,
Mm.
And when I read the scriptures, it's like more alive. Yeah, and the reason why I bring this up is because I have another hot take, and I actually want to get your thoughts on this. Is that like for the longest time, like I grew up in church thinking like, oh, there's a pastor, he's preaching, he's teaching us like the truth and like
Right.
all this stuff. But when I read the gospels, like I like listen to the gospels a lot. Jesus is like, you have one father, you have one teacher. The
Mhm,
Holy Spirit will teach you.
mhm,
And I feel like we've lost this connection, sometimes out of fear of like, oh, I'll teach you this, and this is what I'm experiencing. But you need to go to the Lord and find out what you're hearing, and then
sure.
we'll come tested with each other. And I feel like we don't have that kind of model of discipleship. It's always just this authoritarian, I'm here to tell
Sure.
you what the truth is and you better follow it. So what are your thoughts on that?
So it's Danny, it's so funny that you asked me that. I was on a podcast, I mean on a panel last week, podcast style panel last week. And one of the things that kind of invoked, and I mentioned this during that telecast is that I think that a lot of church people are malnourished because they only eat on Sundays. And whether it is ego, whether it is lack of self-awareness, I think that many pastors don't really empower people through discipleship to know the Lord for themselves. And whether that keeps their churches full, the tithing buckets full. I don't know if people still use tithing buckets, but if it keeps the church packed or full, or whether it's just ignorance, right? To properly disciple somebody means to draw them closer to the Lord. And whether, the voice that the pastor or the shepherd should yield should be the voice of guidance. I mean, Ephesians 4 says that he calls some apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers for the building of the body so that we're mature. We're not confused by every wind and doctrine. And so there is that guiding light, that guiding voice, and those anchors, right? The anchors and to ensure that we don't go too far. And so that's exactly correct. And I believe that the importance of the fivefold ministry give imperative to the maturing of the body of Christ. But I do believe that if our people are not really empowered to know the Lord for themselves, or really empowered to study the word for themselves, then, like we haven't positioned them well enough to really succeed in their Christian walk. The pandemic was literally a moment of revelation where many people were so lost. Many Christians were so lost because the churches closed down. Some pastors were great at streaming, some didn't, and some people, many Christians were so lost because they had no direction. They had nowhere to go. Many pastors passed away, and just like my dad, passed during the pandemic. A lot of people were just totally lost, and that was indicative of the lack of training and preparation that pastors and shepherds are giving to the sheep.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. My theory, I'm more like a pessimistic thinker, so like you could push back. But my thought is like, again, I think it was more of like this fear of like, oh, I don't want to like lose my kids to like the world, so like
Mm,
I'm gonna create these constraints. But it was like a method of control, and that's something I'm like realizing more and more is that like, how can we create a safe space where we can foster trust over control, right?
yeah,
Where and even like guidance, I see more guidance as like a direction of like, hey, you're going the wrong way.
sure.
But like the prodigal son, I tell people like if they're on the wrong way, tell them to go faster because it's a dead end anyway, and hopefully they'll run back. So what are your thoughts?
So I actually have something that I think is pretty cool to also assess. I think from a psychological, sociological perspective, it is also the thinking that you have, I think is apropos, and I think you're on par. I don't think that you're far reaching or even new age, but I also think it is a product, the thinking and the ideology is a product of the time. You think about in the 70s, the 60s, like you would believe a president. If a presidential candidate got up and said something to you and said that these were the numbers or this is what's trending or this is what's happening abroad, you would just believe them. You would just follow the day of law and order. What the authority states, what authority figures state. And today we're very much a pessimistic society. We don't trust our government, we don't trust educational institutions, we don't trust colleges, many people don't trust churches, and we have so much information at our fingertips that we need to adjust our model to lead people to the truth, not to force the truth. Because if you lead people to the truth, then people will have the realization that I came to this to myself. I've come to know God for myself, and I've had assistance kind of creating the foundation for me. But forcing the truth, it will not be sustainable. We're just not that generation anymore.
I also think it's just human nature for us to rebel against like
Yeah.
any authority, right? Whether it's good or bad. So like I think that always needs to be in the back of the mind. So that's a good transition to like so you like encounter the Lord, and at this point, are you still like being like, no, I'm never gonna be a pastor, or like what happened?
So it was the worst thing in the world that I told my father that I had an encounter with the Lord, because he was like, okay, minister. I was like, Okay, great. I was happy behind the drums, playing the drums and just being a musician. You know, every pastor's kid plays some type of instrument or you're given something to do. So like it was the worst thing in the world. I told my father, really fully dedicated. There was like minister, elder. I was like, where did these titles come from? All of a sudden I'm ordained and I'm wearing a collar and I'm just like, what's happening? But in terms of pastoring, so transparently, my other siblings are pastors as well. My dad, I'm the child of my dad's second marriage, but in his first marriage, all of his kids, well, out of three, two of them are pastors and in the gospel community. And so for the youngest to be the pastor, that wasn't expected. It was expected maybe the others would take the church. And my father said, like, for 2 years, 3 years, he was dealing with this, that no, it's the youngest guy who's going to succeed me. And I just didn't sit well with me. It didn't sit well with me with how he did it. It didn't sit well with me with kind of just the process of it all, right? And then also the Lord didn't tell me. So, in classic Alex fashion, I just went on a fast and said, hey, I can't accept this assignment unless the Lord tells me. Like, this is a lifelong assignment. And I've seen it close up. Like, it's not like I have some dream and passion of pastoring. I see the seat and I see the pulpit. And I'm just like, let's go. And I'm super excited to do this because I see all the sacrifice. I see, my parents and grandparents have given to people who walk away from them, who kind of mistreat them. I've experienced it all. Church hurt is, a lot of people in the pews talk about this concept of church hurt. There's no church hurt like a pastor being hurt, when they give their all, when they're sincere, like really good leaders and they give their all and they're kind of burnt by those same people they give to. And so I had a really jaded view of pastoring. And so I went in prayer. I had like this crazy, Danny, like had this crazy Ezekiel-like experience. I was taken from my room and shown a new vision of the church. I saw the church with diverse faces. I was in a pulpit, saw diverse faces, saw the church reconstructed, and then saw these initials that said M. Came up out of the vision. I said, what is this? Maybe I need to eat something. I've been fasting too long. Whatever is happening to me. But the Lord revealed to me like the initials, institutional, international ministries, matched what I saw in the vision. So I just waited a little bit and then I let my father know. I said, okay, the Lord showed me this vision. But there's something I'm going to have to do that's controversial. Two things. I'm going to have to, if I'm going to accept this calling, I'm going to have to change the name of the church and I'm going to have to leave our denomination. And our church is a legacy church. So there's like 50 churches that were groomed. One of our mentors, Reverend A.R. Bernard, CCC, A.R. Bernard was groomed by my grandfather. He came out of our church. And so like, he kind of speaks to the weight of that place. So to leave Kojic, change the name was blasphemy. But I had the audacity, a little bit of ignorance and just obedience to do so. And my father said, if that's what the Lord gave you. So in 2017, we officially, changed everything under his leadership. And then he transitioned me to pastoring in 2019. So it's been a roller coaster, to say the least, to be kind.
There's a saying, courage is when you know the hard and painful thing and you do it anyway.
Yeah.
But that's also the same definition for foolish. And that's why life is hard.
That's what I said. It's a little bit ignorance, faith, however you want to call it. Depending on who you're speaking to, they'll give it one of those labels.
No, but that's why I love the fact that you fasted and you literally wanted to hear from the Lord, right? Because I'm a firm believer hearing God's voice. At this point I've never heard it audibly, but just this assurance, there's no way I'm gonna do this unless he's gonna bless it. And that's the only incentive I have of because I've read Jonah way too much. I'm like, nope, I have to do this. Okay, let's go. So yeah, I totally get it.
Yeah, Mark Batterson has a really good book on hearing the voice of the Lord. It really impacted me and really finding a still place outside. And for me, most people, their context, I need to find my way to the church. For me, it's I need to be in solitude away from the context because the church context represents not only spirituality, but also community and also family. So there's a whole bunch of, there's this element of family legacy that is kind of tied into all of this. And so that was also another thing, do I want to take on this family legacy and leading this historic church, and also the church is popular because in its Pentecostal charismatic context, the church had a huge popular choir, the institutional radio choir. You can Google them. They had 28 albums, gold records, all this stuff, really popular choir. But where I was taking the church was slightly different. So didn't want to feel like I was disrespecting the legacy and moving away. But I knew that eventually we'll record again and do all that great stuff. But I knew that we needed to strike out on what the Lord was saying. And yeah, I got a lot of heat. I mean, and that's being kind. And I mean, people were hurt. They were angry at my dad that they would allow me to do that. You know, there was a lot of controversy over changing it, but again, foolishness, courage, regardless of the two, I know that it was what the Lord instructed me to do. And the church is thriving and doing well.
Yeah, I consider that like the furnace moment of like, all right, I'm gonna burn, but like hopefully I won't burn to a crisp and I'll come back okay. But
It's like the men of the Hebrew boys that are like, if we die, we die.
yeah,
Hey,
yeah, and Daniel, it's like it is what it is. Yeah, and like you're mentioning, like I realize that's also why you need voices inside your bubble and outside your bubble. Again, I'm going through the Gospels a lot, and like Jesus was like, "You guys are too needy. I need to go to a desolate place where no
telling you.
one knows what I'm doing." And only this year I'm coming to terms that there's a difference, and it's more of a perception that like one man's loneliness is another man's solitude, you know.
Yeah, that's so
And
true.
like this is where like the whole imagery of like the Superman and the Fortress of Solitude, where like he's talking
Mm.
to his father and we are talking to our father. It's just like, oh, there's this like beautiful thing where like being alone actually is like a saving grace.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus clearly in the text, he knew the capacity of those who were following him. He knew the capacity of the crowd. So after he would do and feed and teach and impart, he would leave the crowd. He knew the capacity of the 12. He knew the capacity of the three. You know, Peter, James, and John, when he was crucified, there was only one there. You know, the beloved John, who said, okay, look after my mom. But, you know, when he's in the garden, he's by himself, just him and his father. And so he knew the capacity of each group. And so he had to even place boundaries there.
So what was that process like? So you tell your dad, okay, we're gonna change the name and like get out of the denomination. Like what were the steps? Because I think that's a really good
Yeah.
story or like a good like case study of like how to transition out of this traditional mindset into a new thing. And
So
like the one last thing is like the theme of like new wine is coming up a lot, and I feel like that's what happened to you guys. You guys created a new wineskin.
yeah, it was a lot of, it's a case study of what to do and what not to do. So my dad is a classic charismatic pastor, makes announcements over the pulpit, doesn't have like crazy board meeting. He makes a decision, then tells the board. So yeah, it's like case study of what not to do, and then me undoing and having to redo and having to do over a lot of the things that he did from, you know, the churches. When you have a nonprofit status and you have things that need to be governed a certain way, you have to redo certain things. And so my story is a case study of what not to do, because my dad was like kind of like didn't communicate this the right way. So, you know, you also have other people who feel like they're in position to be the next leader, and so it caused controversy there. It caused a church split. It was bad. My dad's last 4 years, just through decisions and just different things, he had about 4 church splits. And so at my grandfather's height, the church had thousands of members. At my dad's height, the church had hundreds of members. When I took the church, I had 15 people there, 15 people. And so it was literally building and starting over. But now I realized that it was necessary in what we were charting now. And it had to we really, literally needed to hit the reset button. And so it is literally a case study of my dad saying, okay, you're called to do this. He, you know, kind of makes an announcement, but there's a church split that happens right before that, and it becomes a whole big thing. And I take the church, and my dad at the time also was dealing with sickness, kidney failure, renal failure. So he's also sick, frail. And so my mom is trying to help to navigate. She's one of the pastors in the church, trying to help navigate me. And so for 2 years between 2017 and 2019, I put a 5-point revitalization plan in the church. So we were revitalizing the church. The goal in those next 2 years, because my installation was going to be in 2019, was to revitalize the church legally, administratively, financially, from a cultural standpoint, and then also spiritually, changing the culture. So it's like turning the soil over. And we saw certain people who were there trying to linger, figuring out what it was going to be. Then most of the people left. And so we had a good base of 15 people. And then when I took the church 2019, the church grew 162 members the first year, which was great. It was like, all right, we're we're doing well, we're growing, 162 added members the first year, hyper growth, great. Then next year, pandemic hits, my father passes, all the stuff happens. So it becomes haywire. And now the church is like really rebuilding, getting back to where the same momentum that we had in 2019. So, but yeah, my story is a case study of what not to do in terms of succession and some key areas of what to undo or what to look out for. Or for a person like me who's going to come into this seat, for me to tell somebody, make sure these things are in place before you get there. Make sure, the board is all apart and on the same page. Make sure the board is assembled, having regular meetings. Make sure that there is an actual plan that is ironed out before the congregation as what this succession look like. What's the timing of this? What does this mean? And actually having meetings outside of just having church and making announcements. And so, yeah, I could definitely design and build a case study on this exactly. And most lessons you learn based on the failures, not on the successes. So, yeah.
Yes, that's true. However, I feel like no one documents it because it's not a glorified thing of like writing down all your failures, but like it's so useful. So like if you ever like wrote an article on like how you would do it differently, I think it would be amazing.
Yeah, it's so funny. I need to. I need to just do an op-ed on it, just like kind of post it somewhere and kind of figure out exactly how we can make succession something that is not painful. I mean, whether the context is the charismatic church, the evangelical church, the Pentecostal context, we're seeing kind of the baton being dropped in every context. You see ego there, jealousy there, you see feuding there, family squabbles there, financial issues there, not really preparing the congregation. When you have a church like my church where it's 3 generations of churches and you have somebody who's been there, their entire family's been there for years, you have to prepare them to hear a new voice. You have to prepare them to go into a new direction and then ensure that every change is not happening all at the same time. You may want to change the board around 1 year and then change the service style a different year. And then if you're one of those churches that add lights and you may change it, like doing it all at once I have this concept that when you are shepherding or any aspect, you need to lead them, not leave them. And I think that many times with changes and certain things that we do and certain changes that we make in churches, we leave people, we don't lead them.
Yeah, it's funny because like I'm reading through First Kings and like I'm like, oh, it's not a church problem with succession; it's a human problem because everyone wants to play the Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
And like they're not like they're not like literally killing each other, but like they're killing reputation and like dividing and
Yeah, no, it's real. First of all, shout out to House of Dragon. My wife and I are finishing the 2nd season right now, so I'm catching her up, a little bit. But yeah, it's the same concept. Who's going to bend the knee? Who's going to kiss the ring? When we actually understand that we're not building empires, we're building God's kingdom. And I think that's the distinction. Like, we're not called to build our own empires. We're called to build God's kingdom. And as soon as we get to that place, we'll realize, hey, if a member goes to another church, hey, we're on the same team. Maybe they need something different. Maybe I was useful in a certain aspect in their life. Or say if somebody wants to start their own ministry, or say if somebody just decides to, hey, I'm moving, or say, hey, this person mentions, hey, I can't come to the church every day or come every Sunday because I also work. I also do these other things. I think that when we approach, as kingdom, we're not so caught up in membership size and who belongs to us. We're not tagging and associating people with our churches more so, or identifying people, or branding people with our denominations or with our name. We're pushing the message of Jesus Christ. We're proclaiming the kingdom rather than proclaiming our church. And I think that we really this day and age, we're serving a generation that really seeks to serve the Lord. And they're really trying to find Jesus, not to find religion or your church.
that's why I keep bringing up the whole ego thing because when I heard sheep stealing, I'm like, they're not your sheep. What? They can go wherever they want. What? Maybe
Yeah.
you're just a bad shepherd.
It's a real thing. I mean, the fact that they said sheep stealing is probably indicative of, it's so funny. Literally, as we're speaking, I'm going through a process with another pastor where pretty interesting. One of my mentors has really kind of instilled in me the importance of celebrating people who serve in your church, even when they decide to leave. So this could be a case study as well. This one individual, they just felt like their time was up in our church, and we celebrated them, and they honored him because of his years of service. Then he went to join a ministry in Virginia and did well there. Post-pandemic, he's got a raise on his job up here, decided to take on that role in that job, and he's joining our church back again this month. And I had a conversation with his previous pastor, and we just dialogued. It was amazing, and I don't think I've even had an experience like that where somebody comes from another church, or or this, and we have such a healthy dialogue. And I think it's important to kind of see this is the way kingdom should be. Like if somebody decides that this church meets their needs, or this ministry meets their needs, and maybe we don't meet their needs, then we're okay with it. This is not sheep stealing. We're building God's kingdom. And so whatever's going to help propel people to where they need to be, that's where they need to be, and kind of being okay as a shepherd saying, hey, this church may not be for you. And that's okay. I know a church down the street that I think would be perfect for you. Doing that, I think, shows the true heart of today's pastor.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer now that kingdom doesn't expand, it extends, because it's the relationships, right? So like we keep thinking church is a building or a location, but it's like, no, it's the people gathering there. And one thing I always wanted to get into church planting. I don't know if that's going to happen because I see a lot of crazy things, which is why I kept saying this is like a Joe Rogan podcast. So on the internet is fine with church people, but I think it's an amazing story when people leave, right, and they work at another church, and they're like, "Where did you learn that? Like, you're so helpful." And then they refer back to your church.
Yeah, that's
And
great.
so, yeah, and so you're like fostering, and that's what discipleship is. Like, we're raising you up to go out, right, not to hold you in.
Yeah, I mean, there's too many lids placed on gifts in the kingdom, and yeah, I've heard a lot of horror stories when it comes to the church planting. I think that there's too much emphasis, and I'm just going to be really transparent. I think that there's too much emphasis placed on numbers rather than the quality of the ministry that you're presenting, the quality of discipleship, and the quality of the heart. The quality of the heart is something that's not really spoken about. Where I've gone to a lot of pastoral conferences, and there's a lot of models to growth and to grow your numbers, but not really a lot on your heart. I think that one conference that I've attended that's been very unique in that is 30 for 30. I was invited by Reverend Menard and Reverend Adam Dorso. Adam's a great friend of mine, and there's kind of like this really great dynamic of the seasoned generation and then the next generation, and them colliding. And there's a really great nuance and conversation between how to from the younger generation, how to be more efficient, innovative, but then from the older generation, the impartation to us is not just on how big your church is, because the individuals who are the elder statesmen they've built large churches, they've been there, but it's really more so focused on the posture of your heart. And how's your family? How's your wife? Your church is big, but how are your kids? Church is great, but how's your character? And I think that's a different approach and something that I've seen unique in that context rather than some of the others that I've been a part of.
Yeah, another hot take is I'm so confident now that the kingdom is just vibes, like literally. And it's more of are you a vibe setter, or are you trying to create an environment with lights and sound and
Yeah.
structures, but it's because you're cold,
Yeah. It's so crazy because when you study, there's a concept that, hey, he added to the church daily, but that wasn't every person who planting their church blew up. He added to the church of Jesus Christ daily, right? God added to the church, his church, his body daily. And so when Paul goes to Asia Minor, goes to different places, modern day Turkey, and establishes Corinth or Philippi, or they're all different cultures. They're all different expressions, which is probably why Paul writes to them all differently. He has hard-headed Church of Corinth, and then he has such a lighthearted letter written to the Church of Philippi. And so you see these different dynamics and different cultures in these two different places, but also still the leading to the same God, and fostering great community within both of these contexts. And I think that is important for us to kind of realize where we are. Church in New York City will not be like church in South Carolina, so why compare yourself? Will not be like the churches in Atlanta. And so how do you foster and steward the communities that you're in, right? What needs are you meeting there that are different from some of the Midwestern states or the Southern states? And that's why it's important to, in the whole church planting context, that, you take models, you see certain things that may be great, but also really praying and discerning, where you are and what are the needs there. Because what's working in forget what's working in terms of numbers. What's really supporting that community there may not support New York City. New York City is very unique. So to try to do in New York what they're doing in Ohio is not going to be applicable, you know?
I think one thing that I realized that like I didn't realize until I got out of my like conservative bubble is that understanding his tone, the letters, Paul's letters, is actually really hard. Right? Because I only understood it one way because that's how I was taught.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Because like Paul is like literally like the fourth person of like the Trinity in the conservative side.
yeah,
But he literally says in Cross like it's not about me or Paulus or like what is going on. Just as long
yeah,
as it's about Jesus and like I don't know. So that's why I've just really simplified it of that name. Like there's something like you like this whole podcast you started off with a fight for identity, right? And a lot of times identity is just in a name. Like what does that name mean? Like and in a person what like it's like a Pandora's box of like oh what's inside that name. There's like a history and personality and like baggage and all that. So yeah, I just come back to like again this is like my quantum physics rabbit hole of like the singularity is just in a name. And if the name is Jesus, like I find it funny all the time because I listen to Joe Rogan a lot. He always like Jesus Christ, and I'm like, oh hey, you're in the podcast.
yeah.
Just the fact that he's saying the name, and someone might take offense to it, but for me, I'm like, oh yeah, thanks for saying my Lord's name in you.
The endorsement, you don't even realize it's an endorsement. Yeah.
Yeah, I realize like God is literally using everything, and I'm not the savior, so I need to relax and just enjoy this ride.
Yeah, 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 definitely. And to that point, you know, because and it's this fifth year of me pastoring, the fifth official year has been such a freeing year. It's the first time, I'll be honest, that I've actually enjoyed pastoring. I've enjoyed seeing the growth of people. I've taken off the pressure of building because sometimes like you go to these conferences, you go to these workshops and you see success stories or you especially if you're a pastor on social media, it's like a death trap of comparison. Like you're literally seeing what everybody's doing and secretly like spirit of covenantness is like growing. It's already rooted there and it's growing in your heart. But this is the first year, like my wife and I are coming, we're having a great time. We're having a blast seeing the spiritual growth of people, you know, seeing where they start off here and seeing they're going here and now they're stepping out doing this and now they're witnessing to their family members and now they're launching out doing some things, launching nonprofits or just other things. It's been a blast and taking that pressure off like my ministry needs to look like this or needs to have this accelerated growth in this amount of time. Taking that pressure away has really purified my heart as well. And I don't think that many pastors are as like if we were to all be honest, like and transparent, like the desire for growth has like consumed us. And I think that we need to really get back to a pure place of just winning the loss. You know, one of the things that we've started doing in our ministry is literally going into the community. Like we're claustrophobic by now, right? This is our fourth or fifth service outside of our church door, just on the street. We did something 2 months ago called Church in the Court. We went to the housing community, Whitman houses, shut down the basketball court, did service there, and then did a basketball tournament there. Like right after we baptized in August outside, we just closed down our doors, did something called stoop service, had our neighbors sit on the stoop, baptized in the street. Like, cause it's like, let's get out. We're just indoctrinating people, preaching to the same people, but there's a whole world of people out there who are not saved. There's a whole world of Christians who don't know how to properly witness to somebody the love of Christ, the compassion of Christ, you know, because it's many times seen as dogmatic, legalistic. But how have we really trained and, you know, taught our people to be true disciples of Christ? You know, you don't have to have the title of evangelist. You know, everybody's not going to be on the train, the subway preaching, you know, but how can you be a witness on your job? How can you give somebody hope who just had death in their family? How can you mentor a young person and plant a seed there, you know, see that their life will be impacted because you took time, you know? And I think that's what it's really about. And so this level of ministry going in this direction has been a joyful experience. You know, every ministry has its highs and lows, stressful days, longer days, but this year I've been having a blast and I haven't been able to say that in the previous years of me leading a church.
Yeah, life principle I have now is like I don't listen to people who have less joy than me, right? Because the gospel is literally good news of great joy.
Yeah.
And I realize, wait, but like I wasn't joyful as a Christian. There's still something wrong. And I mean, I might edit this out, but so between you and me, like there was a period where like I started over, like I got pissed off because I was like, you guys lied to me. Right? The version of Christianity that I was taught was so joyless and so indoctrinated and like ritual based. Like I was miserable. And I always thought I was a problem. But now on the other side of like just freedom and joy in Christ, like I see like how everyone else is still in that like bubble of like I have to do this
Yeah.
because and this is part I would add in is that I think what's lost in discipleship is that it's not just training, right? It's practice. It's a way of life,
It's
right?
practice.
And so everything you described is like, no, I'm being a normal person in my job, in my neighborhood. And when I see someone down, I'm giving them life, but not just in a positivity way, but in like, hey, God will make this better. And if not, there is a better story after all of this too.
Yeah, I can't tell you. I don't know what it is about maybe the season of my life or just the community that I'm finding myself in. In the last 2 months, I've done three separate trainings in three different areas on discipleship, whether it be digital discipleship, whether it be just kind of like outreach initiatives and discipleship. And you realize how many people are just either nervous about spreading good news. I've never, there's never been a time where there's good news and you're afraid or have trepidation spreading it. It's because it's been presented to us in such a dogmatic way. But if you know that they're having a sale down at the store, or there's they're giving out free items at a place, you're happy to tell people about this, and salvation is a gift that's free, like you should be thrilled to tell people about it. But I think that because we don't present it the right way, we don't identify those opportunities to really spread the gospel. Or maybe we put too much pressure on ourselves to be theologians, when in actuality, good news doesn't take much. It takes honesty, truth, transparency, and boldness, and most of all, love and compassion.
That length really makes you slow down into consumable chunks. At the end of the day, like Jesus has hung out with like 12 dudes, for 3.5 years, So like I feel like that's also lost, is that we forget discipleship isn't just like transferring this information. It's like let's talk about this. What's going on?
Fine.
Like
Yeah.
practical. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even like the story of the young man who was vexed with a demonic spirit, and Jesus comes down from the mountain of transfiguration, and they can't cast out the spirit, the demon or the spirit, and Jesus casts it out, and they wait till they go to dinner later on, and they're like, "Hey, man, like, why weren't we able to cast this spirit out?" He's able to say, "Hey, these things." I mean, he embarrasses them a little bit. He says, "Faithless generation." He embarrasses. He's like, "You guys are making me look bad in front of," but taking that time, that even with that moment of rebuke, there's a moment and an opportunity for discipleship and learning and growth at the dinner table, right? When he has time to pour into them and spend time and sit with them. And he has time to use this as a teaching moment. And so even whether it be, Jesus walking on water, or him being in the boat, in the other context where the seas are raging and they know him as teacher, but then they learn him as savior, protector. There's always opportunities for them to learn, and Jesus is always pushing the disciples into positions where they have to learn. And so he empowers them to go out 2 by 2, but he also empowers them in lessons and time. And I think the other thing for the big church model where we have missed this is that Jesus disciples 12. He doesn't disciple the crowd, he disciples 12, and the 12 go out and minister to others. And I think that we've kind of gotten that loss. We look at numbers and not look at the fact that, hey, Jesus spent time, intimate time with others, because he knew that it would take that closeness and that time and that intimacy to really impact the life.
A couple of last questions.
Oh, let's
I'm
do it.
super curious as to, one, like how you met your wife, because I'm just always interested, and then two, her learning that you're third generation, like your mom's, like your parents are pastors. Like, was there any like, whoa, like, do I want to date this guy?
So the funniest thing, I never, ever, I literally swore off of it. After I became a pastor, I said, there's no way I'm marrying another minister of the gospel. My wife is a pastor. She's a vice president of a company called Guideposts Magazine. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Norman Vincent has like this brand that he launched years ago. So she works in there. Her whole life is God. And I was like, literally, I don't want to marry a minister of the gospel, let alone pastor a church. I resolved that I was a pastor. Okay. But my wife and I met because we both had to minister at a conference, and they separated the men and women. It was a huge organization. And I spoke to the men, she spoke to the women, same conference. And then they did a panel at the end and brought us both sitting at the table to answer questions. So that's how we met. And we just honestly hit it off. We hit it off as friends. At the time I was dating somebody. So yeah, there was nothing going on there. And then, me and my girlfriend are on the rocks, kind of rocking. And then one day I kind of look at her and it's like, hey, what about this person? But then, the constant reminder that she's a preacher, and yeah, this is not going to work. And so we fought on it for years, went back and forth for a little bit, went through some marital counseling finally, and resolved that we belong together. And the pressure coming into this context, because even though my wife is a minister of the gospel, she comes from a very, she also like has this nickname called sneaker preacher. So she's just like this girl, she's real petite girl that's like radical, but at the same time wears sneakers, not into the traditional kind of church model in that sense, right? In terms of how she views ministry. And so she comes into mine and sees that like I come from this lineage of church, right? This church has all this profound history. She doesn't really know much about it. And so everybody says, wow, you're coming into this church. Wow, you're gonna be, and she's like, she has no awareness of where I come from, really, the weight of it. But what I love about it is that my wife didn't allow it to impress her, and she didn't take on that weight to say, "Okay, I'm coming as the third generation or fourth generation." She didn't. None of that stuff really mattered to her. She loved me, and we both just so happened to be ministers of the gospel, and we now work together in ministry, which is great. But on top of that, she just didn't allow that pressure, or she's not, number one, my wife is not easily impressed by anything, which is great. She wasn't easily impressed by me, or even when I thought I was somebody, she was kind of like, okay. So it was great. So I had to really work to get her affection. But what's really great is that we became friends, and we became best friends, and then started dating, and then worked for years towards this process. We met in 2018, dated in 2019, married in 2023. Shout out to Reverend A.R. Bernard and some of our other mentors who helped to counsel us and walk through this. It was an interesting process, but we were, and also like these church influences and what a pastor should be and what a first lady should be, quote unquote first lady, what this process should be. I would get advice to say, don't marry a preacher, you're going to be fighting over the mic, this type of advice here and there. So it was all over the place, but it was great that we had sound guidance, and a lot of that religiosity was still pouring in. And so her and I both fight, even in our day, in our ministry now, and in our personal lives, distinguishing between legalism, dogmatic practices, and really trying to find the fruitfulness of the gospel and what he's calling for his church. And so it's always a fight, especially when you've been indoctrinated. She grew up, the first church she grew up in was it was a denomination called apostolic, right? She grew up apostolic, so heavy, they didn't affirm women preachers. And so she went through all of that, so that tradition as well. So undoing has been a lot of both of our journeys together, undoing and unlearning, and finding a happy medium and a balance.
It's kind of crazy, like even from my home timeline, like all the stuff that's been happening like post-pandemic, because like the big thing on the liberal left is like being woke, but I'm like, we're not woke, we're like waking up,
Yeah, yeah.
And I feel like God is really waking up people who grew up in an older, like more like the tradition of the fathers. That's what Jesus says all the time. I'm like, that's so legit. And it's refreshing because like, yeah, there was a period where I thought like I'm gonna be a prophet and like condemn, both sides, because I understand like the bad and the both sides. But I'm like, no, Danny, just chill out, see what God's doing, and just love people and like have good vibes, because like, yeah, I think one thing that social media and like just media in general just pollutes my mind is that things are so bad, but that's in the world, right? In the
Yeah,
church, we're being renewed day by day.
yeah.
Like me, like hearing your story and meeting guys like you, yeah, it's just a refreshing reminder that like no matter how bad things get, like information wise and news wise, like God is doing something amazing with His people.
Yeah.
And there's always a remnant, like even your church started with remnant and like a mustard seed and it grew. So like, yeah, I have more
Yeah,
hope.
I think it's always important to remember that. And then also understand like give yourself grace that we're still figuring it out. I'll say this in true transparency as a like African American pastor. I love the Lord with all of my heart. There's certain values and principles that I will never deny and never get rid of. But also I'm an African American gentleman. So election time was a time where we really had to like sit back. There were some agendas on both sides that I just didn't agree with. Not to go politically, but there were just certain things on both sides that didn't agree with. So where do I land? And it's important to really have to, settle yourself, have a true conversation with yourself, and then be responsible with what you say across that pulpit, because you're literally influencing the decisions of people who sit under your teaching. And giving yourself grace and time to say, I don't know until you're sure. I think it's great, realizing like you are an authority figure, but you're not the authority. And so giving yourself grace, I think it's really vital as well as we're growing, waking up, right? So to say, evolving, growing, but also still knowing where those anchors are, where those boundaries are, that things move beyond principle of value and those things that will sustain you.
What are you hoping for at Faithly?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to connecting with people who are similar to me and within the same context and different. In terms of like just like LinkedIn, right? You want to find people in your field who you can relate with, you can share stories, you can share information, but also people outside of your context that can stretch you and expand you, right? For Faithfully, just looking for some leaders who are maybe in the New York area that I don't know, some of the things that you're doing, some of the things that are working, and just how you're balancing life. I know that I'm bivocational. I still work in corporate America, plus pastor, plus a husband and father. So how do you balance this, right? How do you live? So finding some other people, share those stories and share those experiences with, and then also some people outside of my context that I can kind of just connect with and also learn about and connect. I think I'm a person that just lives off connection. So Faithfully is the perfect platform for me.
And how can we be praying for you and your family?
Yeah, I think that 2025 is going to be a very interesting year. My wife and I are working on another child, so yeah, you can pray there. Pray for my strength, but just also pray for our community. We're in the Fort Greene, our church is in the Fort Greene Clinton Hill community. Just praying that there's a bit more unity there with a lot of different elements, whether it be the concept of gentrification, the migrant population in our community. There's a lot of dynamics within that Fort Greene, Clinton Hill, Brooklyn community. A lot of different socioeconomic representations within the same community. Like it's beyond crazy. Like down the street, you have NYCHA, and then right up the street in our block, we don't have a house worth less than $2.2 million. So like the nuances are there, which causes a bit of friction and tension. And so we're trying to find the best way of meeting the needs of both, of all communities in that area. And our goal is to really foster a great sense of unity there. So prayers for that, how we can expand and further unify our community. And then for my family, just, prayers for the health of our family and for balance. I think for us, we kind of feel a little stretched. Definitely prayers for more balance.
Okay, thanks for coming on the podcast. This is great.
Thank you, Danny. Appreciate it.
Bye, guys. How do I? Oh, okay.